Hi, my name is Didier. Welcome to the lab. We are at Maison du Whisky over in Paris in the underground room, which we call the Islay room because it is dedicated to whiskies from the island of Islay over in Scotland. So why are we here today? We're going to talk about peat. And Islay is well known for its peated whiskies. And to talk about peat in more detail, we thought we'd get in touch with our friends over at Kilchoman. Hi, how are you doing?
So thanks very much, Didier, for inviting me on to talk a little bit about peat and what makes the Islay whisky so famous here on the island of Islay on the west coast of Scotland.
So the Kilchoman distillery, they have a specific bottling called the 100% Islay. And for this bottling, they actually use their own cereal, which they malt themselves using the local peat. And so this is what we're going to talk about in a little more detail. All right, let's get started. Okay, so first of all, let's take a look back on what peat actually is. So peat is used as a heating source. Typically, this is something that on Islay, for example, they had to use because they didn't have easy access to coal, for example, and there weren't many trees on the island, so they used the local peat. So it looks like a big chunk of earth, actually. And what it is, in fact, is decomposing vegetation over thousands of years. It's kind of like the first step before moving on to charcoal or coal, or even oil down the line. And so the idea is that this is used during the malting process, but before we talk about that, let's look at what it's actually made up from. So specifically on Islay, what are the vegetations that actually decompose and become peat? And how does this kind of influence the flavor?
So here on the west coast and all over Scotland, peat exists and it's rotting vegetation made up mainly of sphagnum moss, grasses and heather.
And how is the peat harvested actually? So it's kind of dug out of the ground in a certain way? Is it prepared in a specific manner? Does it have to dry? I don't know.
So it is cut with a special spade, a long, thin spade, which is called a farrel. And if you're doing it by hand, you use that, and that was traditionally the way it was done, and that's the way we do it. And it's cut into sort of bricks, can be long or quite short. And clearly it's quite hard work. And now obviously they do use automation to cut it, but we still carry on doing it the traditional way. And we have a peat bank just close to the distillery. I think it's important to actually emphasise that Islay and the west coast of Scotland has a particular style of peat, which because here on Islay we're surrounded by water, there's a lot of salt and in the air, and so we get this very briny maritime style of peat, which is so famous for Islay single malt.
Okay, and so now that you have your peat, it's going to be used during the malting process. Can you describe that, at what point it comes in, and what are the variables that you can use, I don't know, the amount or the timing, which will influence the taste of peat in the malted barley and therefore in the final whiskey? So
the peat is a hugely important part of the malting stage for us here at Kilchoman and for other Islay single malts. It's used at the drying stage. Before we start to dry the malt down, we light a peated fire, and traditionally peated fires were lit and were used to dry the malt down completely down to 5%. So back in the old days, traditionally the style of whiskies was very, very medicinal and very strong, and now they've cut back the time on peat. The malt is very moist still. It's about 30 to 35% moisture is still in the grains, so that's when you can impregnate the grains with the peat smoke and the peat reek, and we tend to use damp peat, so we create as much smoke and peat aroma into these grains, so that within a given period of time, maybe 10 or 12 hours, which we tend to go for at the moment, we can get between 10 to 20 parts per million of phenols, and therefore the longer you peat it for, the more peaty the style of whiskey will be. And we're doing various experiments now with unpeated, lightly peated, more heavily peated, and very heavily peated, because we are now on site 24/7, or will be very soon. So it gives the opportunity of experimenting with the peat. So peat we can use to influence in various ways, to get the typical Islay flavour and the Islay style, which is, I think, very important to Kilchoman. We want a peaty style of whiskey, whether it's lightly peated or more heavily peated, and that is all down to the time we light the fire for and how much smoke and peat reek we get up into the grains lying on the floor above the fire. And every distillery will determine how they're going to do that. Most will order their malt with a certain parts per million of phenols. We can control it a bit more than the others because we're doing it all ourselves. So we can be very flexible in our approach. We can do lightly, heavily, or even more heavily, or even non-peated. I think it'd be a shame, non-peated to me, Islay whiskey doesn't have the ring about it because people are looking for something that's maritime and peaty, and therefore it would be a shame not to have some peat influence. But I think more distilleries are now playing around with the peating levels they use so that they can showcase their style of single malt with different peating levels.
Okay, what about the next steps as far as distillation, as far as aging in casks? What are the different things you can do to change, to kind of influence the flavor of the peat?
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, we all talk about the phenol level, and we're talking about the phenol level at the malting stage. After 10 years in cask and under maturation and then into bottle, it loses about half the peating level. So if we're talking about 50 parts per million of phenols, which is the malt we buy from the local maltings here on Islay, that will be down to about 25 parts per million of phenols by the time it's about 10 years, 12 years of age. So it's slightly misleading when we talk about the peating level because it is at a malting stage we measure it. We don't measure it at any other time, but we do know that it loses quite a lot of that peaty, smoky character from the malting stage through to maturation. Okay, well, thanks a lot for all these answers. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that explanation, and I'm sure if you've got any questions, they can be answered one way or another. For those of you watching us at home, give us a thumbs up if you like what you see, follow us for more. And the question of the day is about peats. Is there any other way than using malted barley that is peated to give a peated flavor to your whiskey? If you think you know, type it in the comments, and we'll see you next time.